I was still wearing my widow's black when Bishop Yoda came to claim me as his wife. The fabric was stiff and foreign against my skin, still carrying the faint, dusty scent of the funeral barn where I had watched my husband Samuel's plain pine coffin disappear into the earth. I was still wearing my widow's black when Bishop Yoda came to claim me as his wife. The fabric was stiff and foreign against my skin, still carrying the faint, dusty scent of the funeral barn where I had watched my husband Samuel's plain pine coffin disappear into the earth. 11 days. It had been 11 days since I became a widow, and the man standing in my kitchen, quoting the book of Ruth about how a kinsman redeemer takes the widow into his home, was the reason Samuel was dead. I didn't know that then. Not yet. 11 days. It had been 11 days since I became a widow, and the man standing in my kitchen, quoting the book of Ruth about how a kinsman redeemer takes the widow into his home, was the reason Samuel was dead. I didn't know that then. Not yet. All I knew was that the most powerful man in our Amish district was offering me protection and provision, and my father was ordering me to accept. The baby in my belly, Samuel's final gift, hadn't yet begun to show. And the truth, when it finally came, would force me to choose between my soul and my survival. All I knew was that the most powerful man in our Amish district was offering me protection and provision, and my father was ordering me to accept. The baby in my belly, Samuel's final gift, hadn't yet begun to show. And the truth, when it finally came, would force me to choose between my soul and my survival. My name is Rachel Baylor, and I was raised to believe that a woman's voice belonged to her husband first, and to the church second, never to herself. I grew up in a white clapboard farmhouse with a kitchen that always smelled of rising bread, a mother who taught me to stitch straight seams and keep my eyes downcast, and a father who measured his daughters by their usefulness and their piety. We were Swartzentruber Amish, the most conservative order, where even the buttons on a coat were considered too worldly, and the ordnung dictated every minute of every day. In that world, I learned that a good woman is a silent woman, that questioning authority is a sin, and that the bishop speaks with the voice of God. I believed all of it, or at least I tried to, because believing was easier than the alternative. I met Samuel Baylor at a youth singing when I was 17. He wasn't related to the bishop, despite the shared surname. Baylor is as common as Miller or Yoder in Holmes County, but the coincidence always made people raise their eyebrows. Samuel was a carpenter with hands that could build anything and eyes that saw the goodness in everything. He wasn't the kind of man who led hymns or sat on church councils. He was the kind who stayed late after barn raisings to fix a widow's broken door or carve tiny wooden animals for the children who had none. When he asked to court me, my father said yes only because Samuel's farm bordered our own and the land would someday merge. Love wasn't a requirement, it was a side effect, and I was lucky enough to catch it. Our courtship was quiet and sweet, full of stolen glances across singing circles and buggy rides where we talked about everything except the things that mattered most. He was the first person who ever asked me what I thought about something, and I remember the shock of it, the realization that my opinions had value. We married in the fall, under a sky that looked like a quilt, and I moved into the small farmhouse that Samuel had built with his own hands. For 4 years we were happy. Not the happiness of storybooks, but the deep, steady happiness of two people who chose each other every single day. We worked side by side in the garden, we prayed together every evening, and we dreamed of a house full of children. The only shadow in our marriage was the bishop. Bishop Amos Yoder had been the spiritual leader of our district for 2 decades. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a beard that flowed down to his chest, and a voice that could make the rafters tremble. He carried himself with a weight that pressed on everyone, and his interpretations of the ordnung were stricter than any I had ever known. Samuel never spoke against him openly, but I noticed he came home from church meetings quieter, more withdrawn. Once, late at night, when the kerosene lamp was burning low and the world was silent, he said, "That man doesn't serve God, Rachel, he serves himself, but no one will ever hold him accountable." I asked him what he meant, and he just shook his head, kissed my forehead and told me not to worry. That was 3 months before he died. The day of the accident was like any other late summer Tuesday. The air was thick with the smell of ripening corn, and the cicadas were buzzing so loudly you could hear them from inside the house. Samuel was in the barn, repairing the hay loft ladder that had splintered the week before. I was in the garden, pulling carrots for supper, when I heard the crash. It wasn't a loud sound, just a splintering groan and then a heavy, sickening thud that made the ground shake beneath my bare feet. I ran, my heart already knowing something terrible had happened. The barn was dim, dust motes floating in the shafts of light that cut through the cracks in the walls, and I found him lying on the floor, his body twisted at an angle that didn't make sense, a massive wooden beam across his chest. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing me. I screamed and screamed until my throat gave out, and by the time the neighbors arrived, he was gone. The funeral was a blur of black dresses and murmured prayers and casseroles I couldn't eat. The bishop presided, of course, his voice rolling over the congregation like thunder, speaking of God's mysterious will and the peace that passes understanding. I sat in the front row, my hands folded over my stomach where I had just begun to suspect new life was growing, and I felt nothing but a cold, spreading void that seemed to swallow every prayer and every hymn before they could reach my ears. Afterward, people filed past me in a slow procession of black, their voices murmuring that I was strong, that my faith would carry me, that the community would wrap itself around me like a warm quilt. I nodded and said the right things, and inside I was screaming so loudly I was certain someone would hear it. But no one did, no one ever does. That night, alone in the farmhouse Samuel had built, I sat at the kitchen table in the dark and let the silence press against me until I could barely breathe. The kerosene lamp was unlit because lighting it would have been an admission that I was still alive, that I was expected to go on living. I touched my stomach where the secret was growing, a tiny ember of Samuel's life still burning inside me, and I whispered to the darkness, "I don't know if I can do this alone." The darkness didn't answer, but somewhere deep in the house, a floorboard creaked, and I chose to believe it was Samuel telling me I wasn't alone at all. The first sign that something was wrong came 2 days after the funeral. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a bowl of broth my mother had left, the surface of it cold and congealed with a thin skin of fat, when the door opened without a knock and Bishop Yoda walked in. He filled the small kitchen with his presence, his black hat in his hands, his beard neatly trimmed, his eyes sweeping over my dishevelled hair and wrinkled dress with what looked like concern but felt like calculation. The air changed when he entered, growing heavier, as if his authority had physical weight. I offered him coffee, because that was what you did even when your husband was 11 days in the ground and your soul felt like a torn piece of cloth flapping in the wind. He accepted with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes, watching me move around the kitchen with the careful attention of a man assessing livestock at auction. I felt his gaze on my back, on my hands, on the curve of my neck, and every instinct I possessed told me to run. But a good Amish woman doesn't run. She pours coffee and waits to be told what her life will become. He sat down across from me and talked for an hour about my future, about how a young widow with no husband and potentially no income would struggle, about how the church had a responsibility to care for its own, about how the Book of Ruth showed us the righteous path of the kinsman redeemer. I listened, my hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold, and I felt the weight of his words pressing me into a shape I didn't want to occupy. He never raised his voice. He never made a direct demand. He simply built a cage of scripture and obligation around me, one verse at a time until I couldn't see a way out. He visited twice more in the following week. Each time he came unannounced, and each time his words grew more pointed, the thin smile giving way to something harder and more insistent. On the third visit my father was there, sitting in the corner like a silent sentinel carved from stone, his presence a reminder that I was not free to make my own choices and never had been. My father had spent his entire life bending his knee to the bishop, and he expected his daughters to do the same. I saw no ally in his eyes, only expectation and the cold demand of obedience. The bishop set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, folded his hands on the table as if he were about to lead a prayer, and said, "Rachel, the Lord has revealed to me that I am to take you as my wife. You are in need, and I am in a position to provide. My own wife passed 4 years ago, and the church would be strengthened by this union. Your child would have a father, and your land would be cared for. It is the righteous path." He spoke with the cadence of a man who had never been told no, who believed his desires and God's will were the same thing. I stared at him, my stomach churning with a revulsion so deep I could taste it. He was 58 years old, with a greying beard that reached his chest and eyes that held no warmth, no kindness, no trace of the gentle spirit the scriptures demanded of their shepherds. The thought of becoming his wife made my skin crawl, as if 1,000 ants were marching across my flesh. But before I could open my mouth to speak, before I could form even a single word of protest, my father's voice cut through the silence like a scythe through wheat. "Rachel, you will accept. This is an honor beyond anything we could have hoped for." I was trapped. In our community, a woman's refusal meant disgrace, possibly shunning, especially if the proposal came from the bishop himself. I had no money of my own, no job, no way to support a baby who would arrive in 7 months. My parents were already struggling under the weight of their own burdens. They couldn't take us in even if they wanted to. The bishop knew all of this. He had positioned his offer so that refusal was not just difficult, it was impossible. He had studied me like a chess piece, and calculated every move before I even knew we were playing a game. And in that moment, sitting at my own kitchen table in my dead husband's house, I understood what it meant to be property rather than a person. I asked for time to pray on it, my voice barely above a whisper, and he granted me a week with a magnanimous nod, his smile never reaching those cold, assessing eyes. As he rose to leave, he paused at the door, his broad frame blocking the afternoon light, and turned back to deliver his final words. "Remember, Rachel, obedience is the highest virtue. I would hate to see you suffer because of a stubborn heart." The threat was wrapped in scripture, padded with false concern, but it was a threat nonetheless. He didn't need to raise his voice. The power was in the silence he left behind when the door finally closed. That week changed everything. I started cleaning out Samuel's workshop, partly to distract myself from the terror that gnawed at my stomach, and partly because I needed to feel close to him, to wrap myself in the scent of sawdust and linseed oil that still clung to everything he had touched. The workshop was a dusty, cluttered sanctuary that time had forgotten. His tools hung in neat rows on the wall, his workbench was littered with half-finished projects that would never be completed. A rocking horse for our future child, a set of chairs for the kitchen that would now never hold our family, and a small locked wooden box I had never seen before. It sat at the back of the workbench, half hidden beneath a dusty cloth, as if Samuel had placed it there deliberately, waiting for me to find it. I picked up the box, its wood smooth and dark from years of handling, and I noticed the lock was flimsy, more a symbol than a security measure. Samuel had always believed in the goodness of people, even when they didn't deserve it. I pried it open with a chisel, my heart pounding against my ribs for reasons I couldn't name, and inside was a stack of papers covered in Samuel's familiar handwriting. A journal. Not the kind a farmer keeps about crops and weather, but something else entirely. Page after page of names, dates, numbers, and accusations. And what I read in those pages, sitting on the dusty floor of his workshop with the afternoon light fading around me, made my blood run cold and my hands shake so badly the papers rattled like dry leaves. Samuel had been investigating the bishop. For over a year, quietly and methodically, my gentle carpenter husband had been documenting something terrifying. A scheme so vast and so carefully hidden that it had been operating for more than a decade right under the noses of the elders and the entire congregation. The journal was filled with names of shell companies, dates of suspicious land transfers, bank account numbers that led to a city 2 hours away, and detailed descriptions of how the money meant for the poor, for medical emergencies, for widows exactly like me, had been siphoned away $1 at a time into the bishop's private accounts. The community fund, the sacred trust that every Amish family contributed to, believing it would protect the vulnerable, had been nothing more than the bishop's personal treasury. But that wasn't the worst of it. The bishop hadn't just stolen money, he had stolen land, stolen homes, stolen futures from struggling families who came to him for help. He would approach a family facing debt, offer the church's assistance with tears in his eyes and prayers on his lips, and then use his authority to pressure them into signing over their farmland to a holding company that he secretly controlled. One by one, farm after farm, family after family, he had swallowed their lives whole and left them with nothing but shame and silence. Samuel had discovered it all by chance, when he helped an elderly neighbor understand a confusing legal notice written in English, and then he had spent months gathering evidence, knowing that every day he continued was a day he risked everything. The last entry was dated 2 days before his death. I read it 7 times, my eyes tracing each letter as if I could pull Samuel back through the ink. It read, "I have told the bishop I know. He denied everything, but I saw the fear in his eyes. He said if I went to the elders he would make sure Rachel and I were ruined. I will not be silenced. I am taking the documents to the English lawyer in town tomorrow. If something happens to me, tell Rachel to look in the floorboards beneath the hay loft." The words blurred in front of me as tears dropped onto the page, smearing the ink. He had known. Samuel had known he was in danger, and he had gone to confront evil anyway, armed with nothing but the truth and a courage I could barely comprehend. I sat on the floor of that workshop for what felt like hours, Samuel's words swimming in front of my eyes, and piece by piece the terrible truth assembled itself in my mind. Samuel hadn't died in an accident. The ladder he was repairing was the one beneath the hay loft, the exact spot where he had hidden something. And the beam that killed him, the massive wooden beam that crushed the life from his body, hadn't fallen by chance. I was suddenly, violently certain that the bishop had arranged it. Maybe he had loosened the beam himself with those soft, prayer-folded hands. Maybe he had paid someone with money stolen from the community fund. But he had killed my husband, murdered him in cold blood, and now he was trying to marry me, to claim Samuel's widow, Samuel's land, Samuel's child, as his prize. The floorboards, the words echoed in my skull like a drumbeat. I ran from the workshop to the barn, ignoring the rain that had started falling in heavy, punishing sheets that soaked through my black dress in seconds. I climbed up to the hay loft on the opposite ladder, the one that was still intact, the one Samuel hadn't been repairing, and the rain drummed on the roof like 1,000 pounding fists demanding justice. The loft was dark and dusty, thick with the smell of old hay and mildew and the metallic tang of my own fear. I pulled up board after board, my fingernails splitting and bleeding, the pain barely registering through the adrenaline surging through my veins. And then I found them. A bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth, exactly as Samuel had promised. Bank statements, land deeds, letters from English lawyers, a copy of the community fund ledger with discrepancies highlighted in red ink that looked like wounds, and a sworn statement from a former church elder who had fled the district years ago rather than continue living under the bishop's shadow. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, enough to destroy the bishop 10 times over. I knelt in the hay loft with the rain pounding overhead and the documents spread around me like an offering, and I realized I was holding my husband's final gift. The truth he had died to protect, waiting in the darkness for someone brave enough to carry it into the light. But even as I clutched the evidence to my chest, the cold reality settled over me like a second-soaked garment. I was a woman, a pregnant widow with no standing in the church, no voice in the congregation, no right to make accusations against the most powerful man in the district. If I came forward with these documents, the bishop would deny everything, and the elders, all men, all loyal to him, would side against me. He would call me hysterical with grief, deceived by the devil, a woman whose mind had broken under the weight of tragedy. He might even find a way to have me shunned, cast out of the only community I had ever known. I would lose my home, my child's future, every connection that tethered me to this earth. The evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed a plan, a strategy, and I needed allies I could trust with my life. So I did the only thing I could think of, the only thing my heart would allow. I went to my sister Lydia. She was older than me by 5 years, married to a farmer named Joseph who was kind but timid, a man who would never challenge authority but would also never betray a secret. Lydia had always been my protector when we were children, the one who bandaged my scraped knees and told me stories when I couldn't sleep and held my hand during thunderstorms. She lived on a farm 3 miles away, and I walked the whole distance in the rain, clutching the bundle of documents under my shawl like a second heart pressed against my chest. The mud sucked at my boots, the wind lashed my face, and I didn't care. I would have walked 100 miles. I would have walked to the ends of the earth. When I arrived, soaked and shaking so violently my teeth chattered, Lydia pulled me inside without a word. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She simply wrapped a quilt around my shoulders, sat me down by the wood stove, and waited with the patience of someone who had spent her whole life knowing when words were needed, and when silence was the greater gift. And then I told her everything: the journal, the embezzlement, the stolen farms, the bishop's proposal, Samuel's final entry, the documents in the hay loft, the certainty that the accident was not an accident at all. Her face went pale as new milk, then flushed red with a fury so pure it seemed to radiate heat. "That man," she whispered, her hands shaking as she gripped mine, "that man killed Samuel. He is a monster wearing the mask of a shepherd." Then she pulled me into her arms and let me cry until I had no tears left, and my body was nothing but an empty, aching shell. When the storm of weeping passed and I was calm enough to breathe again, Lydia took my face in her hands and looked into my eyes with an intensity I had never seen before. "There is a woman I know," she said, her voice low and steady. "Her name is Helen. She's an English lawyer who helped the Miller girl 2 winters ago when her husband was beating her black and blue and the church refused to intervene. She has a phone in her office in town. She doesn't care about ordnung or church councils or what the elders think. She cares about justice. I can take you to her tomorrow." In Lydia's eyes I saw something I hadn't seen in weeks. Hope, small and fragile like a candle flame in a drafty room but burning nonetheless. The next day, under the pretense of buying fabric for baby clothes, a lie that tasted like ash on my tongue but was necessary, Lydia and I drove a borrowed buggy to a crossroads payphone shanty, a tiny wooden booth that the church reluctantly allowed for emergencies. I had never used a phone before. The receiver felt alien in my hand, cold and heavy as a stone, and when Helen's voice came through the line, clear, direct, unhurried, I almost hung up in panic. But Lydia was standing outside the booth, her hand pressed against the glass, her eyes locked on mine, and she nodded. So I didn't hang up. I took a breath that shuddered through my entire body and I spoke. I told her everything, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush like water from a broken dam. The evidence in the oilcloth bundle, the embezzlement from the community fund, the stolen farms and ruined families, the bishop's marriage proposal and my father's command, Samuel's final journal entry, the beam that fell, the floorboards in the hay loft. Helen listened without interrupting, and when I finally fell silent, my throat raw and my heart pounding, she said 5 words that changed everything. "I believe you, every word." Then she paused and her voice grew more serious. "But we need more than documents, Rachel. We need a witness, or better yet, a confession. Can you get him to admit what he did?" That was the beginning of the most terrifying week of my life. Helen and I worked out a plan over the crackling phone line, a plan so dangerous that every time I thought about it my stomach clenched and my hands went numb. She gave me a small recording device, a tiny silver rectangle no bigger than a spool of thread that I could hide in a basket of sewing supplies. She said it was legal to record a conversation if I was a participant, and she coached me on what questions to ask, what phrases to use, how to lead the bishop into the trap without him ever realizing the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. The goal was simple but deadly: get him to threaten me or to admit something incriminating, anything that would corroborate the documents and give the English police enough to open an investigation. I knew it was dangerous. If he discovered what I was doing, he could hurt me or worse, but I had no choice. I was carrying Samuel's child, and I owed it to him and to the truth. I told the bishop I had prayed on his proposal and that my heart was leaning toward yes, but I needed to ask him some difficult questions first, questions that a widow with a child on the way deserved to have answered. He was so confident, so utterly sure of his power over me, that he agreed to meet me in my home the following evening without a moment's hesitation. I spent the entire day preparing, my hands trembling so badly I could barely thread a needle or set the teacups on the table. Lydia came over to help me clean the house from top to bottom and to give me courage, squeezing my hands and whispering, "You are not alone, Rachel. Samuel is with you, I am with you, and the truth is with you." I held onto those words like a lifeline. When the bishop arrived, I offered him tea with a steady hand that belied the terror clawing at my chest like a trapped animal. I let him talk, let him settle into the chair, let him believe he was in complete control. He spoke at length about the blessings God would shower on our union, about how my child would be raised in the shadow of the church's authority, about how he had been so terribly lonely since his wife's passing and believed with all his heart that I could fill that void. His voice had the cadence of a prophet and the warmth of a grandfather reading to his grandchildren. He said all the right things, and I could see why people trusted him, why they handed over their money and their land and their daughters without question. But his eyes stayed cold, flat and grey as winter slate, and I knew I was looking at the face of a predator who had never once been held accountable. Then very quietly, almost casually, I asked the question that changed everything. "Bishop, do you know what my husband was working on before he died? I found some papers in his workshop, something about the community fund." The words hung in the air like a blade suspended by a thread. His face changed. The mask cracked, and for the first time I saw the predator beneath, the cold, calculating creature that had been hiding behind scripture and piety for 2 decades. His eyes narrowed to slits, his jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a low, dangerous hiss that raised the hair on the back of my neck. "What papers, Rachel? What have you found?" I didn't answer. I simply sat there, my hands folded on the table, and I waited. And then, believing he was still in control, he made his mistake. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles whitened like bleached bone, and he said, "Whatever Samuel told you, whatever he left behind, it will do you no good. Your husband was a foolish man who didn't understand how things work in this world. I tried to reason with him, I tried to show him the path of wisdom, but he wouldn't listen. Accidents happen to people who don't listen." He paused, and I saw something cruel flicker across his face, a flash of satisfaction, of pleasure even at the memory. His voice softened into a mockery of pastoral concern that was more terrifying than any shout. "If you are wise, Rachel, you will destroy those papers and accept my generous offer. Otherwise, you might find yourself in a similar situation. A pregnant widow living alone, so many things could happen. A fall down the stairs, a fire in the night, a tragic accident on the road. It would break my heart, of course, but the Lord's will is mysterious.